On March 31st, 1941, as the first light of dawn crests the dunes of North Africa, the roughly 1,500 British and Commonwealth soldiers dug in around the forward positions of Mersa Brega greet a new day. Little do they know that mere kilometers to the west, against the express orders of Hitler himself, Erwin Rommel, nearly 50,000 troops and some 200 armored fighting vehicles are heading straight towards them. Rommel is determined to take Mersa Brega and push into Cyrenaica. Can the British stem the tide against such odds? We shall see. I'm Indy Neidell, and welcome back to this North Africa miniseries, a sub-series of World War II. This week, we will for the first time witness Rommel unleashing his full strength onto the British positions. So far, we've seen but skirmishes and minor clashes. I'll keep the prelude tight because I want to get right to the battle. This week is really all about Mersa Brega. So here's a quick overview of some important developments relevant to our tale between the 26th and the 30th of March. On March 27th, a coup in Yugoslavia 2 days after the government signs on to the Axis powers topples Prince Paul's regency. Hitler fumes, and Berlin pivots to planning immediate action there, and London's gaze follows. With attention pulled northward, North Africa slips further down British and German agendas, just as a decisive moment is forming in the sand. It is no surprise, though, the British Commander-in-Chief Middle East Archie Wavell's outlook doesn't shift, and he still maintains that a full German attack in Africa will come earliest in May. On the German side, there is also nothing new on the 28th, which is literally what the war diary notes that day. While dumps are filled, units close up ranks, orders are issued. There is one new thing at sea, though. British submarines finally draw blood in the Mediterranean. A German convoy headed for Tripoli is struck. One freighter is sunk and another crippled. Vehicles, fuel, and stores go to the bottom. It is too little too late, though, and it does not stop what is already in motion. As a result, when the 31st of March rolls around, the defenders do not expect what is about to hit them. Let me paint you a picture of the situation on the ground. The village of Mersa Brega is flanked by natural barriers to the north and the south. To the north, the Mediterranean Sea stretches to the horizon. To the south, the Wadi El Fareg, an imposing trench running through the desert, stretches to the horizon. Since it runs parallel to the coast for about 160 kilometers, Mersa Brega is essentially unassailable from either of those directions. This funnel, also known as the Brega Gap, is like 29 kilometers wide. Through it, the Via Balbia, the coastal road connecting Tripoli with Benghazi, runs along the northern edge of the village, like 3 kilometers from the sea. The village itself is nothing more than a small collection of whitewashed houses. North of the village, a 3-kilometer wide belt of sand dunes runs along the coast. To the south and southwest, interspersed salt marshes cut into the approaches, together squeezing the 29-kilometer Brega Gap between the sea and the wadi down to roughly 6.5 kilometers of navigable ground for an attack. The throat, General names Cyrenaica Command, must defend. It is no exaggeration, then, that this is a defender's wet dream. But it gets even better. 2 kilometers in front of the village sits a small rocky hill, Cemetery Hill, which serves as both a great observation post and a strong defensive position. It is within this environment that Name has constructed his defenses. But however defensible the geography might be, you still need men, guns, and machinery to do the defending. And this is where Name's problems begin. His infantry is composed of just 1 battalion. Not only that, the 1st Tower Hamlet Rifles, under Lieutenant Colonel Shipton, only have 3 companies of infantry instead of the usual 4. B and C companies occupy trenches mostly in front of the village. The trenches have firing steps and they're well built, though they cannot be used to their full potential since Shipton's men are far too few to occupy them all. The one remaining company he has, A Company, is dug in on Cemetery Hill. What he does have is support in the shape of Y Company, 1st Battalion, Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, a machine gun company under Captain Hensman, equipped with 12 Vickers ready to spit lead at any German who dares approach. 6 of these are dug in south of the road, together with C Company on firmer ground, 3 with B Company north of the road, and the remaining 3 keep watch with A Company atop Cemetery Hill. And what about, well, bigger guns. Okay, name has the 104th Regiment Royal Horse Artillery under Lieutenant Colonel Todhunter. Todhunter has 16 25-pound guns spread across 2 batteries, 339th and 414th, in direct support of Shipton's infantry and Hellman's machine guns, located 3.2 kilometers to the rear of Brega. He, too, has also sent some spotters onto Cemetery Hill, a troop of the 339th Battery, with telephone wire running all the way back to the main artillery positions. They spot. Then the 25-pounders direct their song of death towards the heavens. Since the Africa Corps has the 5th Light Motorized Division, including 1 tank regiment, Neem better have some anti-tank guns. And he does. Just. J Battery of the 3rd Regiment Royal Horse Artillery, with its 9 2-pounder anti-tank guns, also stationed behind the infantry positions. And what of tanks? Wavell's skeleton crew in North Africa has an armored brigade, the 3rd, but it's scattered over 120 kilometers from Beta Foam over Agedabia to Brega. The 5th Royal Tank Regiment is the only part of it remotely close to the front here, but it sits in 3 parts, broken down A-13s, about 20, strewn between Beta Foam and Agedabia, 1 squadron of 11 on the Brega line, the remainder, another 13 or so, 8 kilometers behind, with brigade headquarters at Mott and Betafal. That is all the armor available for use within any reasonable time frame. Many of the units just mentioned have only arrived in the last couple days, and the strain shows. The tanks have fared the worst. Forced driving has taken the regiment from battle-ready to almost unusable in a matter of days. And air cover, well, there is none. Or rather, while there is some on paper, it is not deployed around Mersa Brega. The 37th Light Anti-Aircraft Battery protects the skies over Benina Airfield near Benghazi and its environs, but not over Mersa Brega. Then we have the 1st King's Dragoon Guards. We saw them last week, armored car detachments sent patrolling and out for reconnaissance, and as such, not part of the fixed defenses. Their headquarters also sits behind Brega at Motten Betafal. This is what awaits Rommel when he pushes ahead the early morning hours of the 31st of March. Compared to what he has at his disposal, it does not look good for the British. With Rommel march some 9,300 German soldiers of the 5th Light and around 37,000 Italians from the Arietta Tank Division and 10th Corps, which consists of infantry divisions Pavia and Brescia. So Rommel is attacking a force of 1 reinforced battalion with 4 divisions. Although, of course, not literally his entire force is about to march on the British positions. All are part of the operation, but that includes guarding the supply dumps in the rear and against possible flanking moves by the enemy, having a reserve, and so on. The units really doing the attacking are a reinforced 3rd Recon Battalion, Machine Gun Battalions 2 and 8, and Panzer Regiment 5. Still, the confrontation appears to have a foregone conclusion. But do not forget the potent defensive geography of the Brega Gap. After all, you only need 1 strategically placed cork to halt the advance of hundreds of liters of wine. And I'd like to give Sebastian Brandstetter, who wrote this script, some kudos for his prose right there. The wine, that was good, right? The wine thing? Yeah, I thought that was a very nice metaphor. Well done, Sebastian. Like last week, it is the King's Dragoon Guards out on reconnaissance who first notice the German host approaching. The Germans leave El Agela before first light, although not as a single force. Rommel is a trickster, after all. The main force travels down the Via Balbia, but a smaller contingent of German armor turns southeast off the road towards Matten-Jofer. The idea is to use one of the tracks cutting between the salt marshes south of Brega. And it is here where the first encounter takes place. Men of the King's Dragoon Guards are rudely awakened by the clank of tracks atop their resting place for the night, a sand dune. One car immediately races back towards Brega and reports the first unit they encounter. German tanks on the coastal road, although at this point, the Dragoons do not know the half of it yet. At first light, a British response materializes, although it is somewhat unclear whether it is the direct response to the Dragoons' warning or simply part of the offensive reconnaissance scheduled for this day. Whatever the reason, 6 cruiser tanks from A Squadron, 5th Royal Tank Regiment, wittingly or unwittingly, together with a patrol from the KDGs comprising 3 armored cars and a self-propelled anti-tank gun, are on a collision course with the German flanking force. Pretty much immediately though, two of the cruiser tanks suffer mechanical problems and they need to turn back. At 6:30 a.m., the forward elements of the Germans and the British patrol engage, and a frantic firefight ensues, with no side managing to inflict any serious damage. Then Major Pritchett, a squadron commander, spots more tanks and trucks pulling up behind the already engaged German tanks. He realizes he has no chance now, and his decision to disengage is further sealed by a report from another KDG patrol further north with a direct view of the Via Balbia. Lieutenant Budden, who at first is hopeful to maybe spring a trap on the approaching vehicles, realizes once closer that this is not going to happen. What unfolds before him is a force of some 2,000 wheeled vehicles and 200 armored fighting vehicles stretching more than 32 kilometers down the coastal road. His patrol heads back to report this. Considering the difference in size between the two forces, the KDGs and A Squadron are lucky as can be, getting away with a damaged turret ring and one destroyed armored car. This actually wraps up pretty much the entire participation of the KDGs in the upcoming battle. They have done their duty, spotted the enemy, and relayed the information. Now it is time for the dug-in troops to do theirs. Meanwhile, the main German advance has halted at Matenbesker, 2 to 3 kilometers in front of Cemetery Hill, readying to strike. Yet another flanking force sets out, with Machine Gun Battalion 2 heading south. They get bogged down in the Minnesle salt marsh, and they spend the day fighting mud instead of the British Army. At roughly 8 a.m., the battle for Mersa Brega begins in earnest. The first British troops to feel Rommel's wrath are the carriers, lightly armored tracked vehicles used to transport infantry, machine guns, and their crews of C Company Tower Hamlets dug in on Cemetery Hill. With the carriers heading behind the hill, 3rd Recon with its armored cars, motorcycle troops, and some tanks can close up on the seaward side. This move begins the envelopment of Cemetery Hill while providing a direct line of sight into the defenses. While Rommel is daring, he is no fool, so he also secures the German perimeter, sending a machine gun section through the dunes north of the road, which digs in roughly 1 kilometer west of Brega. At the same time, the gunners of the 75th Field Artillery Regiment race to get their 12 Krupp-manufactured light howitzers primed and ready to unleash their fury. They then open fire. In seconds, the white houses of the village atop the ridge are either reduced to rubble or set aflame, though they have been, well before now, abandoned. The same cannot be said about the trenches held by B Company of the Tower Hamlets, with 1 platoon suffering a direct hit, several men killed or wounded, and 2 of the 12 Vickers machine guns destroyed. That's not all Rommel has planned to soften up the enemy. The soldiers in the trenches might hear a faint humming sound just then, which soon turns into the howls of an infernal siren. The screaming Stukas have arrived. They pound the British, and Corporal Otto Ruprecht, the man in charge of the machine gun section sent through the dunes earlier, tells us what happens next. German machine guns began chattering like angry woodpeckers. Desperate enemy soldiers were scrambling to find shelter from searching bullets and pirouetting like drunken ballet dancers when shot. The rattling guns continued sweeping the township with deadly fire. This chattering is directed at Cemetery Hill, and by 9 a.m., the observers atop it can see German armor approaching. Then, everything hits the men of Shipton's A Company at once. Artillery, dive bombers, machine gun fire, and a German advance from both the road and the sand dunes to the north. By 10:15, it is clear the hill will have to be abandoned. The artillery spotters from 104th Royal Horse Artillery Regiment and 1 platoon from A Company are left behind to delay the German advance while the rest evacuate. 25 minutes later, the spotters cable back to their batteries with an urgent request for artillery support to cover the final retreat off the hill. And thus, soon comes the response of the British big guns. The 104th unleashes 3 shoots. A shoot here means 1 called firing mission, 1 concentrated burst of artillery at a specific target of 50 rounds per guns. If all guns join in, and it is not exactly clear that they do, then that would mean that 9.2 tons of high explosive shells are flung at and around Cemetery Hill. Fortunately for the retreating British, and unfortunately for the advancing Germans, the barrage proves to be unpleasantly accurate. 2 panzer attacks were thrown back. Although the high explosive shells were ineffective against the German armor, direct hits were enough to tear the tracks off the bogies and to give the crews a nasty shaking. Some of the shells even hit near the makeshift headquarters of General Streich. In response, he orders his Stukas to retaliate. And when they do, the complete absence of any anti-aircraft guns is really felt by the British. They can do nothing other than to duck and cover. However, while the British artillery fire is truly something to behold, it is not enough to prevent the Germans from occupying Cemetery Hill. But they are not feeling very triumphant. Instead, they are worried. The resistance by one company backed with artillery is far more effective than what they expected, and they begin to doubt whether they really can take Mersa Brega. A British counterattack at this critical moment could maybe tilt the scales. Brigadier Latham, senior British officer on the ground, certainly seems to think so. He wants Cemetery Hill reoccupied. As you'll remember, he only has like 11 tanks at his disposal. The artillery and anti-tank guns are set up in defensive positions behind the town. There's no answer at all to the Stukas, and the Germans have already occupied positions north of the road in front of Cemetery Hill. So a pure infantry assault would be a suicide charge. No counterattack comes then. But for about an hour, the battlefield is calm as the Germans get into position for an assault on the positions behind Cemetery Hill, and the retreating A Company reinforces the trenches held by B and C companies. Then around noon, the 5th Panzer Regiment attacks once more. Stoic and unflinching, the British infantry fiercely holds the line. Then, backed by more artillery support, the British tanks of C Squadron of the 5th Royal Tank Regiment finally come into play. This confrontation between the British cruisers and the German tanks, the latter supported by some of the Italian Ariete Division's armor, is short and decisive. C Squadron, outnumbered and outgunned, falls into a disorderly retreat, and yet the British infantry holds fast despite their armor being beaten back. Major Puckle, having assumed command of C Company Tower Hamlets, says that his men were quite happy and intended to stay where they were. Somehow that's enough, with the Germans again breaking off the attack. They don't know that that is all the tanks the British have at Brega, and the frantic and determined British infantry seems to have given them the impression that pushing further right this moment is unwise. Again, the Germans regroup, and at 2 p.m. the fireworks start again, heralded by the sound of screaming Stukas, yet the British infantry holds. Then the German tanks roll forward again. This time, they are greeted by J Battery of the 3rd Regiment Royal Horse Artillery and their anti-tank guns. Sergeant Finnegan reports, "We stopped the first 3 tanks and were credited with being the first people to destroy German tanks in North Africa." While lethal enough, the anti-tank barrage does not stop the German advance entirely. That's why, just after 3 p.m., Brigadier Latham orders all the artillery to focus on the advancing German armor. This proves too much for the German tanks, and they disengage a second time. Once more, Latham considers a counterattack, even ordering the artillery to prepare to move westwards towards a more offensive position, should the infantry be able to advance. While the flaws in such a plan remain the same as they were 5 hours ago, this time, something else stands in their way. Throughout this miniseries, we have seen that Erwin Rommel is an independent force in the theater, and from the fairly recent past in France, we know he can also be so on the battlefield. London and Wavell have not yet learned this, failing to take Rommel into account in their projections. That changes today. Just as Latham is deliberating, he gets word that another German force is emerging from the dunes north of the British positions. As usual, Rommel has not spent the day away from the actual fighting. "I spent the whole day on the battlefield with my Chief of Staff, Lieutenant Colonel von den Borne, and in the afternoon reconnoitered the possibility of attacking north of the coast road." It is through this path, found by Rommel, that Machine Gun Battalion 8 now emerges. The British infantry, already having exceeded any reasonable expectation of valor, is now under pressure from 2 sides. At 4:30, Shipton, dreading being outflanked or worse, encircled, orders the infantry to retreat. Brigadier Latham does not quite give up yet, though. At 5:30, he sends a request to the 3rd Armored Brigade, imploring them to attack the German right flank using all tanks at their disposal. However, Michael Gambier Perry, commanding the British 2nd Armored Division, refuses. He's worried about dragging his few tanks into a nighttime engagement against an enemy with a clear numerical advantage. As dusk begins to fall on Mersa Brega then, the battered and bruised British begin their retreat. Rommel has won, and the Allied soldiers have paid a steep price. Worst off are the Tower hamlets. Of their 800 men who greeted the morning at Mersa Brega this day, only 350 will answer roll call after the retreat is over. Rommel has this to say: the British had apparently beaten a somewhat precipitate retreat, and 50 Bren carriers and about 30 lorries had fallen into our hands. For the 1st of April, I ordered our forces to close up in the area Mersa Brega and Matten-Gjofer. Could this German victory have been avoided? The answer, at least according to historian Norman Murphy, is a definite yes. First, the contribution of 3rd Armored Brigade to the defense had been virtually non-existent. Second, why weren't the dragoons employed after having returned from reconnaissance? The appearance of 30 armored cars and 3 anti-tank guns might in itself have been enough to halt the German-Italian attack. While I cannot know if they, by themselves, could have changed the outcome of the battle, who knows what could have happened if this force had advanced in those critical moments when Latham considered a counterattack. But I am not a big fan of what-ifs. But there is, perhaps, another question. Who's to blame? Some historians put all the blame on Weiss, at times even leaving criticism behind and employing vitriol. The truth, likely, is that a man, overworked and undersupplied with resources of all kinds, men, tanks, spare parts, planes, etc., made mistakes. Yet these mistakes were made because of the dire situation he was put in. Weiss himself says this: "I think I only made one bad mistake, but that was the beginning of all our troubles." That mistake likely is the complete commitment of force to Greece, although given the information available at the time in mid-February 1941, one can argue it was the right call. After all, no one, including his own high command, expected Rommel to attack so swiftly. Then again, Weiss's lack of intelligence defense, which he used in his September 1941 after-action report, and a claim he maintained thereafter to justify his lack of preparedness at Brega, cannot, on the evidence discovered, support his claim. But whoever is at fault, this week, the Battle of Mersa Brega has been lost by the British, and their position in North Africa is in jeopardy. Let's let Ralph Bennett put it in perspective. There was not enough intel to have prevented the loss of Cyrenaica, even if its every slightest hint had been heeded. Neither was the British retreat simply the consequence of the departure of most of the army, which had annihilated the Italians. It was also in great measure due to the defects of military tactics and foresight, which were themselves but one facet of that opaqueness of understanding, narrowness of outlook, and lack of professionalism which were to wreck so many of the Desert Army's plans. Rommel has won his first major victory in this theater of the war. The Germans will have to regroup before the next assault, but Rommel has already issued orders to hold contact with the retreating enemy and pursue him further east. But that road is now open, and that road leads to Egypt and the Suez Canal. The Battle of Mersa Brega is an important and yet often neglected part of the history of the North African theater of World War II. This mini-series, like all of what we do, means shedding light on history's underappreciated or forgotten moments, and is part of Time Ghost's core mission. To join us on this quest, join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. These are the newest commissioned officers, and Ray and Linda Barron are the Army members, since they're together, of the week for the World War II channel. Do not forget to subscribe, and I will see you next time.